8 of the Creative Content Studio podcast.
What are we talking about today,
Uh,
Catherine?
We neglected to tell our viewers / listeners what this episode was going to be about at the end of the previous episode.
Yeah.
We're already on episode 8, which
Wow.
is pretty
How's that
amazing.
Yeah.
This one's all about editing. So the last one was about recording 101. So from script to session, how scripted should you be? So following on from that, the editing phase. So you've got your recording in the bag. What happens next? So what does happen between recording and publishing a podcast?
Well, I mean, the easy answer would be editing.
Well, yeah, that's the broad answer.
Although you'd be surprised, some podcasts don't do any editing at all.
Well,
Some will just put it out as it is.
so that's what should happen between recording and editing, kind of.
I think pretty much every show needs something.
Yeah. To polish it.
Yeah, I think so. I think, unless you've got a very well-honed operation.
Like ours.
then there's some editing of some description. But I'd say the editing is bucketed into a couple of different areas for me. So there's editing for what I'd say is like quality, if you like. So this is kind of sound quality stuff and sound improvements, enhancements, that kind of thing. And then there's editorial editing, I would call it, where you're editing for the content. And those are, I mean, you might be doing those two things at the same time, but I tend to split those into kind of two processes, if you like. So I tend to focus on the sound quality stuff first and then worry about the editorial as my secondary point.
When you say editing for quality and sound improvements, what sort of thing do you mean?
Yeah, so there's the obvious stuff, like there's an interruption, for example, somebody knocks at somebody's door, or maybe a pet comes into the room and makes a noise, a small child, those kind of things. Although, depending on your content, that might be appropriate too. You might want to leave that in, I don't know. But there's that, first of all, there's the kind of interruption type stuff. These aren't in any particular order of which I tackle these in, by the way. But there's the sound improvement stuff, I think, is kind of quite key. So if you think, let's just take the basic example of you've got a co-hosted show or you've got an interview show, so two people ultimately. Hopefully you've got two separate audio files. So like with everything, the edit is the edit, but what makes the life a lot easier in the edit is if you recorded it well in the first place. So separate audio files, if you can possibly do that. So if you, like we talked about last week, if you're using a platform like Zoom, just make sure you've got the right box ticked so that you've got separate audio files. Something like Riverside is going to give you that anyway. Squadcast, those kind of things that are built for podcasting are going to give you that anyway. And if you're recording audio in the same space as somebody else, this is where I'd advise, and I've seen some people will do this, so this might seem crazy me saying this, but try not to record into the same microphone. I've seen some people like get one microphone and put it in the middle of a table and then they both talk at it. That requires a lot of discipline and incredible control in terms of your level of voices. It's just going to make the edit a nightmare. It's the way I describe it is it's like trying to unpick a casserole.
Never heard you use that phrase before. But
Yes, so yeah, it's a bit like trying to undo a casserole insofar as it's all in there. It's too late. The carrots are chopped up, the onions are in there. There's potatoes floating around.
Okay, people know what. Yeah,
People know what a casserole is, but you get my you get my point. Is that it's all going to be in the mix already. So you're going to have where there's crosstalk. You're going to have mixed levels of like their volumes. There's going to be all kinds of different issues, and they're all baked in. And you're going to have to try and unpick those if you want to tweak anything about those individual voices. Whereas if you record the voices separately, then of course it's going to be a lot easier to deal with. Everything's compartmentalized. So if you, for example, were a lot louder than me, and we didn't set our levels appropriately when we started the recording, in the edit, I can pick that up and I can say, okay, well, I'm going to turn, it's probably me actually, I'm going to turn me down a little bit and I'll turn Kate up a little bit, those kind of things. So I'm looking at the volumes of our two folks. I'm looking at consistency of the volume by speaker. So, for example, if I get quite excitable, I mean, this is not, I don't usually, but say I
About certain stuff.
about certain things. Say I get loud all of a sudden, and I do that repeatedly, and then I'm really quiet in other parts. There might be some level of that you want to keep for the dynamics, obviously, like if somebody's whispering or something. But you generally want that to be listenable. You don't want to have the listener turning things up and turning things down the whole time. And so the way you do that is you use something called a compressor. So every editing tool that you use, if you're using GarageBand or you're using Logic or you're using Adobe Audition, there's loads of these different, they're called digital audio workstations out there. So these are like editing platforms, basically. And even if you use something like Descript or something like that, they'll all have this kind of feature that you can have compressor. Now, what compressor does is it brings the low levels up and it brings the high levels down, and it tries to level everything out, tries to compress it so it's listenable to somebody without them turning the volumes up and down. So I'm checking for that, the big variations in people's voices, and I'm using a bit of compressor. I'm checking for any big disruptions to get rid of. And then I might be doing things like, again, this is like, depends on your room and the quality of your microphones and things like that, but I might want to do what's called EQ the vocal. Now, if you listen to a portion of the recording where no one's talking, you can hear what's called the noise floor. So this is what's the sound of the room, because every room has a noise to it. If that noise is under about 20 decibels, you probably won't hear anything at all, but there might be a buzz that maybe you didn't even hear when you were recording. But if you can see where it is in the equalizer, you might be able to just lower that frequency so it removes it from the recording. And you need to be careful of that, because you might also be removing something from the person's voice. But I've used that really successfully, EQing out little noises sometimes. If it's a consistent noise that I want to get rid of, like a buzz or a room tone that's not very nice to listen to, a bit distracting. So we've got EQ, we've got some compressor, we've got getting rid of interruptions. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I say like sound improvements. You know, even if you don't know exactly what I just said there, but you've got one eye on those things, EQ, compressor, and then the interruptions, you will see in every editor there is an EQ option. Even like the ones like Descript, which are not designed for people who are kind of audio engineers, you'll see something that says compressor, and they'll have some sort of toggle on them. The way I'd sort of equate this is like, if you've ever used your photo app on your phone and you've hit edit, and you see all these different terms like brilliance and shadows and highlights and all that kind of stuff. If you want to know what they do, the best way to try it is to go all one way and then all the other, and then put it back to the middle. And you'll start to hear the difference in this case, rather than see with your photos. It's the same thing. So if you take compressor, turn the compressor all the way up one way. If it's Descript, it's a fairly simple control. It's one way or the other. And turn it all the way the other, and see what happens. Gain is an obvious one. It's volume. So it's like, I'm turning it up, I'm turning it down. But try it that way. I think that's a really good way to get a feel for things.
Well, a lot is trial and error, isn't it? And like, the more you do it, the more practice you get at it, and you just listen out for what you think sounds good. Like, how do you know what to compare it to, really, as well?
Well, that's a really good point. And there are some rules to apply generally to this sort of thing. So, for example, and I'll try not to get too much into the weeds again.
It's just because I need layman's terms. My brain doesn't work the same as yours.
I think you're absolutely right. Is most people starting a podcast don't want to, or aren't that bothered about getting into that level of detail, and that's absolutely fine. But if you take like EQ, and I'll just give you this as an example, there are about rules. Any noise under about 100 hertz. So if you imagine there's like a spectrum of sound, and it goes from like 0 hertz to about 22,000 hertz or something like that. And those are all frequencies, low to high. Okay. Anything under about 100 hertz, these are like really low kind of rumbles and things like that. So you can safely get rid of everything about under 100 hertz. There's a fairly standard rule that you might apply. With compressor, there's a term, or a measurement, I should say, for volume output that is standardized across the world of podcasting, and it's referred to as LUFS, LUFS. And what we're aiming for is minus 16 LUFS. So when we're compressing our show or we're adding gain to it, we're looking for, and there'll be a meter on your volume, and it will usually say LUFS on it somewhere. You're looking for minus 16 LUFS. That means what you'll get at the end of that, if you've broadly got it to minus 16 LUFS, so sometimes it's a tiny bit high, sometimes it's a tiny bit low, but what you'll get is a podcast that sounds like it's the same volume as everybody else's podcast.
Okay.
Which is important, because what you don't want is somebody like they you imagine like the way that you listen to podcasts, you've got kind of an up next schedule, and it just plays through them. So if I'm out on a long walk, couple of hours, and I skip through or I listen to one podcast, it just goes to the next. You don't want your podcast to suddenly be like the loudest thing in the world, or I'm having to strain to turn it right up to the top and really strain to listen because I can't really hear it. That minus 16 LUFS measurement will get you about there.
Okay. So you talked about obviously improving sound sort of quality and editing that from that sort of perspective. But then what about, you said editing for content as well.
Yeah.
So how do you approach that?
So thankfully, this is a lot more probably palatable to most people. And if you'd skipped the last bit, that's fine. But this bit is kind of, and it's simpler for me to explain as well. And it goes back to the same thing as I keep saying every week. It all depends on your content. How what you're doing in this space, in the editorial space, just depends on your content. So if you're trying to make a show that's 20 minutes long, for example, then you're going to have to make some decisions if you've done an hour's worth of recording. And therefore you're going to have to be really kind of the scripting, if you like, and scripting after the fact. So scripting in the edit is going to have to be quite taut. You're going to have to really think, is every single minute of this useful to somebody if I want to keep it under 20 minutes? So that's where your content's going to help you decide some of that. Whereas if your show's designed to be a 3-hour ramble, then fine. You're probably going to leave a lot more in. Similarly with the editorial stuff, you might be making decisions over, it could even be like opinions you've given or things you might have said as an answer to something. Maybe for example, like in this podcast, we might decide that I've given too much of an answer over one particular aspect, and we wanted to talk about that in a future episode. And I didn't fully explain it in that answer, so why don't we save that and just cut that whole piece? So needs to be some decisions made, I guess, is ultimately what I'm trying to get to.
Which is sort of part of the planning stage as well, even before you start recording, I guess.
100%.
So yeah.
100%. I do always think, though, when you're recording your podcast, and this goes back to a little bit about last week, but is when it comes to recording a podcast, I'd rather have it recorded and then try and edit it afterwards than not have it at all. So if somebody gives, I think we've talked about this in previous episodes, if you let your guest go and they give a really full answer and you don't interrupt, you just let it happen, that gives you a lot more options in the edit. Because you could say, right, okay, actually the full answer was really useful there. Or you could say the first minute was really good and the last 20 seconds where they summarised, but perhaps we don't need all the examples they gave of that. Yeah.
And I don't know, when you talked about like editing for content, I was thinking also not just for the podcast itself, but also for social media content.
Oh, yeah.
But I suppose is that a whole other episode? It's like how you clip stuff up and choose what you...
No, I think that's a really good shout. And actually, like when I'm doing that, so I've done that pass, if you like, that pass for quality, and then I'm doing that pass for editorial. Often that's a really good time to just create a little note somewhere with a timestamp to say there's a really good clip there. And sometimes you're making clips out of several timestamps. You're putting 2 or 3 things together and turning them into a clip, and they weren't actually chronological, which is fine. But you can use that time in the edit to make those notations. So it's worth keeping your ears open. Is that the one?
Yeah.
Your ears and eyes open for anything clippable when you're going through this edit process, because the first time you hear it, often things will jump out at you in that way.
And then a bit of a mixture of both, really. How do you know how much of like people's ums and ahs? You said like talking your guests, sort of allowing your guests to talk. You don't want to interrupt them too much. So you kind of minimal interruptions to maybe edit out. But then if they're a bit nervous or they like to kind of vocally think about their answer or something, or I'm doing it now. I'm terrible at it. But you want to portray potential, I would assume, a natural conversation. But how much should you clip that? Like, to what effect is that going to have?
Yes.
If you take them all out.
This is a decision to be made here. And again, going back to some of the most commonly used pieces of software. So let's take Descript again as an example. And there's lots of others that do this sort of thing. There are now bits of software that you can say, find all the filler words. And it will find every time that you said like, all of those things. And you can just hit remove filler words.
Okay.
And it will take all of them out. However...
But do you want to do that is the
do you
question.
want to do that? Yeah, because it can make things sound really unnatural and quite clipped. And you can lose some of the thinking time, not just from the guest's thinking time, but actually the audience's thinking time. If somebody's exploring a point that's quite maybe deep, or they're talking about something that's quite emotional that's happened, do you want to remove the almost the kind of the contemplative that they, the noise that they made? Do you want to remove that? Maybe you don't, so you have to think about that from an editorial standpoint as to what it is you're trying to create and how does it sound from the listener's point of view. On the flip side of that, if somebody has something that's going to be distracting, it's a bit like, when we talked about sound generally, like, and we talked about mics and quality and all this kind of stuff in the room that you're recording in. And we talked about this kind of concept of things being passable. I think you need to think about that with the ums and the ahs and the likes and the knows and all the other, do you know what it means, and whatever fillers people use. Those can be, they can be a distraction. And so think about it from the listener's point of view. Is it a distraction? And if it is, then you can remove some of those things.
Yeah, because I suppose that can alter the pace of it.
Mm-hmm.
If you take them all out, you can make it, it's a bit quicker, and that might not sound as natural, and also the tone of it.
Totally.
Potentially. So
again, what are you trying to create? If you're trying to create something that sounds fast-paced and energetic, and you haven't got, and the guest isn't necessarily, that's not the way they talk, you could help them sound more energetic by removing some of those ums and ahs.
Just some of the podcasts as well, like the the really professional ones out there, the celebrity ones or whatever, that maybe have a production team. Do they maybe do that for the long edit, like leave more of those in, but then also remove those to make the clips? Because you want the clips to be a bit more fast-paced and a bit quicker, or is that a really stupid question?
That's a brilliant question. Actually,
so
I do it with all of our clients.
Different edit approaches depending on what's being released and where.
100%.
Like how and where things are being published.
As we always say, the content is the driver of this stuff. The content's the king with this stuff. So I do exactly that. If I'm making a social media clip, they perhaps don't need to hear my thinking noises and my ums and ahs and my stumbling over the, as I'm trying to find the word. I do it all the time.
So do I. Terrible at it.
Sound a bit Boris Johnson-y in my approach sometimes.
I wouldn't go that far.
Where it's a bit bumbly. Like as I try and find the word. And then that might be fine for the long form, but I'm not going to put that in a social clip because I'll just bore everyone to tears, and they'll just keep scrolling, basically. So yes, absolutely. Think about the content. Same goes for, take it one step further. If you're trying to turn your podcast into 10-minute YouTube videos, then you might want to bring a different energy to that, and cutting out ums and ahs can do that. One big tip, or not even tip, just word of caution, I suppose, on this, is when you're editing yourself, particularly, and you're not used to editing yourself, you can get quite precious over how you sound. And I would advise everybody to let that go. You have to let that go, because what happens is it will take you 10 times longer, and you will cut out every single little weird noise that you happen to make when you talk, or when you think you make a noise, or something. There'll be a sound that you don't like, and you'll try and get rid of it, and that can it will waste your time, and B, it will make you sound unnatural and a bit odd, especially if you then leave it in for a guest. It will just sound a bit weird. So be mindful of that. I'll mention one more, because I've had clients really self-conscious about this before, similar thing, but is things like mouth sounds and stuff like that. So some of that can be changed with like mic technique and things like that. So if you're right up on the mic and you're getting that proximity effect, so what I mean by that is you're like less than 6 inches away, you'll notice that you get that kind of like intimate radio host sound, kind of whispering Bob Harris, for people old enough to know what I'm talking about.
I don't think I even know what you're talking about.
The old grey whistle test.
Hello and welcome to this week's whistle test.
Right, okay. That rings a bell, but yeah, I don't know the specifics.
So
he
was a presenter who had a very whispery sort of voice, and he always sounded, I don't think he even was, but always sounded like he had a proximity going on.
Right.
It's very in your ear.
Okay.
So
sounds a bit creepy.
It was soothing.
Bordering?
Avuncular.
Oh, okay. He went the other way.
Yeah, no, not weird.
Could go either way.
No, not weird. He was avuncular.
Okay.
So that proximity, with it comes the warmth and the depth of the voice and the intimacy in the podcast listener's ear and all that sort of stuff. But you can get a few more mouth sounds and things like that. So be a little bit mindful of that. So some of that's mic technique and how close you are and that kind of stuff. And another top tip I've heard from voiceover artists and people who do audiobooks, so they're recording for like 8-10 hours, of material, is to eat a green apple. Little top tip before you record something. That can help reduce some of those clicks and sort of salivary sounds from your mouth that might be really distracting.
Interesting.
And apparently this is to do with pH. So the pH level in your mouth, apparently it balances the acidity, and therefore you get less sort of noisy salivary sounds.
Nice. Thank you, Jim.
Bit gross.
Not really.
Don't know.
It's really helpful.
But yeah.
And it keeps you healthy. So
you're 5 a day, kids.
It's got a health benefit.
Yeah. So I don't know whether it's scientific fact, but it's certainly like well known within that community of people who do voiceovers. And
Give
things.
it a go.
So have some green apple on hand if you're doing a recording session.
And I know I touched on this before. It might be a bit repetitive, but you don't need to be like a qualified audio engineer, sound production person. Sorry, I don't know the terms probably, but to do this yourself, right? I mean, obviously you don't have to. You can call in help from people if you're not too confident in doing it. But and it's kind of a two-pronged question. Would you advise people, giving it a go and just trying to get an ear for it? Because ultimately, if it's your show, you know what tone you want to put out there, what your voice needs to be, what your message is. Also, is it expensive to do it yourself? All the software that you mentioned before, the different editing tools, is there one you'd recommend over others? Is it quite pricey? Is it like a monthly subscription you have to think about? Like all those things maybe like factor into how sustainable this is. Sorry, that's about 4 questions in one.
But they're all really, really valuable questions. I think the first point, before I get into software, definitely try this stuff yourself. Like I know, and you don't need to be an audio professional.
I kind of already answered my own question by saying that you're not. Like you are now, I would say. Sorry, that sounds bad. Take that bit out. But I mean, you haven't done any courses, you haven't done a degree in it, but you've learned and you've become an expert by doing it, by putting it into practice.
Yeah,
and
it's
learning as you go.
The University of Life, as they say. So
Absolutely.
yeah, just years and years of practice and sort of home studying, if you like. But But no, not like I didn't go to a university and learn.
Well, you went to a
sound
university, but you didn't study that.
No, I did philosophy, which is thoroughly useless for this. But
Not necessarily.
it's probably
It
why
could
my
be-
answers are so long.
It could be applied to any situation.
Well, I think that's the problem. I think it often is applied to every situation. Sometimes it doesn't
Even
need to
when
be.
it shouldn't
Sometimes people just want an answer. They don't want both sides of the debate.
I do.
I'm not sure you do all the time. But anyway, back to the point. I would definitely say try it, give it a go, trial and error. There's so much information out in the world these days. Look up some stuff, watch some YouTube videos. You will find tons of resources out there. We're going to have a resource out there at a certain point soon, which will
Watch this space.
be a course, and we also do one-to-one coaching sessions on this, so you can book through our website. Little plug there. So they're like £45 for an hour, and people can learn whatever they want to learn. So if you want to do that, you can do that. We've got a course coming up as well, which is you can do it at home, just watch it on your own. But there's lots of free stuff out there. There's lots of different resources. So give it a go. Also, in the world of, as much as I sort of, I don't want to kind of overplug AI tools, because I think there's mixed results with them, but these things are only going to get better. There's no point in us sort of pretending that they're going to be, that they're no good. There might be some quality issues at the moment, but things are getting better by the day. So as I mentioned before, Descript has some fantastic editing tools within there. They let you edit with a script. So essentially what it does is it transcribes whatever audio you've put into it. And then it will show you those words, so you've got the script there in front of you, kind of what you said, and including all the ums and the ahs. And then, like I said before, there are tools like remove filler words. But you could also say search for a certain word within the transcript. So you could, we talked about this subject, so I want to edit that piece, so I'm going to look at that. You can search by that. And then there's also loads of built-in tools for it. So you can hit, there's a button where you can say hit compressor, and it will analyze the audio and do some of that work for you. There's Adobe Podcast, which if you've got an Adobe subscription already, I think you get it with your Adobe Podcast subscription. With your Adobe subscription, I think you get this Adobe Podcast tool, and that will allow you to put in a piece of audio that wasn't recorded very well. Perhaps there was lots of background noise and stuff like that, and it will do a lot of audio processing to it. And then it gives you a really simple slider. How much processing do you want? How much background do you want?
Okay. User-friendly.
It's very user-friendly. Sounds a little bit overly processed and a bit AI-like. But if you've got something that's really badly recorded, it can be helpful if you don't know how to fix it manually. If you don't have that, if you use a Mac, something like GarageBand is a free piece of bundled software for recording any audio. Obviously, it's music, but you can also record podcasts in it and edit podcasts in it as well. So GarageBand is a great tool. There are loads of paid ones. I use Logic Pro personally, which is an Apple tool. There's Adobe Audition. There's lots of these free ones out there. In terms of all digital audio workstations are kind of much of a muchness, really, which sounds a bit. It probably is what it is sacrilege to say to anybody who's an audio engineer, but they generally have the same kind of tools built into them and the same kind of user interfaces. There's a waveform, and you can cut the waveform with a scissor tool, and you can add a compressor, and you can add EQ and stuff like that. So they are broadly the same, just that the ones that are free are usually lesser featured, and the ones that are more expensive are not. And like you said earlier, there's some that do subscriptions too. I think Logic Pro, I might be wrong here, but Logic Pro, if you're an iPad or an Apple user generally, there is the paid version on Mac, which is like 200 and something pounds, and then you've got that's it, you've got the piece of software. But they do a monthly charge if you use it on your iPad, and you can. I've seen people edit their podcasts on their iPad, and it's pretty good. So you could do that, but GarageBand is a free one if you use a Mac. There's tons of
Lots
other
of
free
options.
things. Yeah.
Awesome.
So just try it, definitely.
Or
Yeah.
you could employ someone with experience and knowledge to do it for you.
We haven't really talked about video editing as well. So we've generally focused on audio, and I won't like go into a whole nother thing about video editing. But if your podcast is kind of video first, you may find some basic audio processing tools in your video editor.
Right.
So, for example, in like iMovie, again, is the free one if you use a Mac or an iPad. If you use Descript, you can do a little bit of video editing in there. If you use something like Riverside, they have built-in basic, but they have built-in video and audio processing in there. There's even, if you use Spotify for podcasters, or I think it's creators.spotify.com as your hosting site now, there's even some very basic editing tools in there. So you often find like there's some basic editing tools you've probably already got through something.
So it's worth checking them out.
So it's worth having a go. And then if you decide actually it's not worth my time or energy, then that's where an editor comes in.
Cool. Awesome. Well, yeah, you mentioned about hosting and stuff. We're going to be moving on to that in a future podcast. I think the next one is going to be a bit of from the Q&A session that we put out on social media, getting people's questions about podcasting.
That would be good. We got a few.
We've got a few of those. We might address those for our next episode, episode 9. And then I think episode 10 will be all about hosting and publishing and different ways of doing that, different ways of getting your podcast out there.
I think somebody asked, one of the questions was about that, so we'll try not to...
We're trying to overlap then.
Try not to overlap, but their question was really a really good one.
We might be able to intertwine those into like maybe one mega episode.
Good God.
I don't know if people are ready for that.
Oh.
We'll see.
More of my...
philosophical musings.
I was going to say waffling.
I made it sound better.
Better than it is. Right.
But anyway, thank you.
On that wonderful note.
As always, for some fabulous advice and expert tips.
Thank you. Goodbye. That's not what I say, is it? What do I say?
See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.